I think we are going to get started. We have several people getting close to the number of folks who registered, but I think we could probably get started. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Sheila Mahoney. I'm from SMJ Strategies. Also with me is Monique Garrett from PrismWorks Online. Together we have joined forces to present this webinar on conducting win-loss reviews and best practices for conducting win-loss reviews. So thank you very much for joining. By way of agenda, I'm going to do an introduction to this concept, talk about why we're here and what brought us to this point. Why did we feel that this was something that needed a webinar and attention in our space? We're going to spend most of the time focusing on loss reviews, especially with respect to roadblocks, and understanding what those roadblocks are is very important in order to implement best practices. I'm going to do a case study to show how this works in action and the before and after, perceptions before, and then what actually happens after we take a look at the loss review findings. Then we're going to spend just a couple of minutes on win reviews. This is an area that's often bypassed, if you will, because of the focus on loss reviews, but it is still a very important exercise, and we're going to go into exactly why that's the case and how to do it. And then finally, we'll have a little time at the end for Q&A. Just wanted to encourage everybody, if something occurs to you that either we're not addressing or you'd like to ask a question about, please do use the chat feature to write in your questions, and I'll be going through those at the end. And I'll remind you partway through to do that as well. Okay, great. So why are we here? Over the last 20 plus years in life sciences, I've had the pleasure of having both perspectives. So I started in industry in regulatory operations. Actually, it was regulatory affairs at the time. I'm not going to say how long ago that was, but put it this way, there was no regulatory operations at the time. It was pretty much just regulatory affairs, and no one had a computer on their desk. As a matter of fact, when we had FDA contact reports, we would write them up by hand and hand them to the department secretary to use a word processor to write up and then put in interoffice mail and circulate throughout the company. So having just completely dated myself, I did start out in industry, so I have that perspective. But then I went over to the vendor side. I spent most of that time at regulatory operations vendors as well as clinical operations vendors. And whoops, advanced that a little too fast. And pretty much I did start to do loss reviews in an informal way pretty early on in my vendor experience because I recognized the value of that type of information. Also, I'm the type of person that if I have a lemon, I really want to turn it into lemonade. And that's the way I thought of losses, that, hey, this is a great opportunity to learn, but I also discovered there's a lot of difficulty in getting good loss review information. So during that time, and I would say it was about 15 years on the vendor side, maybe a little bit less, I realized that not many vendors do this, or at least not in a formal way. And I looked at the vendors that I was working at, the teams that I either reported into or reported into me, as well as talking to my peers who worked at other vendors. And then I became curious, why is that the case? And I will address that in a little bit. This webinar is primarily directed to life sciences R&D, but in truth, it's applicable. This process is applicable to any business-to-business sales for the most part. Our experience is derived from this particular space, the vendor ecosystem, mostly CROs, technology vendors, service providers, consulting companies, and what have you. After we go through this process, what Monique and I actually would like to do is to direct either a webinar, a white paper, or most likely a speaking engagement towards the sponsor community, so towards the buyers themselves. And incidentally, I use the term client and buyers interchangeably. For the most part, when I say buyer, I mean the drug sponsors that the vendor ecosystem is selling to. So in any case, I am hoping one day to do that. If anybody has any suggestions or feedback after this, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us. The intention there is to help encourage the buyers to open the information spigot, which is pretty tightly wound shut at the moment. I'm sure you've all encountered that, and we're going to address that as well. So stay tuned on that. So in terms of the current industry status, and this again is just our experience pretty much reaching out to peers. This is not a study finding at all. There was no control group, but by and large, everybody always tries to get information. And more often than not, probably about 80%, the buyer responds with an email. If you're lucky, if you're very lucky, you get an actual phone call. But it's either, thank you, we've gone in a different direction, or it might be a few bullet points, which is good, as to what the decision was based on. So for example, the decision was primarily based on experience and references. Well, that's good. That's better than simply thank you and good luck and goodbye, but it really is not a lot of information to inform corporate strategy. So that happens about 80%. Most vendors do try. I have encountered a few that you know, when I ask about, you know, hey, do you do win-loss reviews? Because personally, I'm always looking to connect with others who have experience in this area, picking up, you know, best practices along the way. So not all of these best practices are from Monique and I. We've learned from our peers as well. But it is surprising. There is a good number. It's less than 10%, but I'm still always surprised when vendors come back and say, well, we don't lose. And that does happen. I have discovered after drilling into that quite a bit is that occasionally there's a very lucky vendor that has a disruptive innovation. It's a blue ocean, meaning their market, there's no other product or service that addresses it. It's a window in the market. If you're lucky enough to experience that where you have no competitors, you know, competitors obviously always do come into the market, but there is a window where, you know, and I've experienced it myself, where you throw out a proposal and it's not a question of if they're going to sign, just when they're going to sign. So that happens in the case of disruptive innovation. And the other part of it is bluster, that I find that, you know, folks that say that they don't lose are trying to project an air of confidence. And usually when that happens, the opposite is the case. Maybe they're in trouble, they're having a really tough year, and the last thing they're going to do is admit it to folks outside the organization or maybe even themselves. And then about 10% of vendors that I've spoken to and work for do actually have a formal process for conducting win-loss reviews. Either they're using an outside source, or they have an internal designated resource, or a team dedicated towards conducting this activity. So that's where we're at. That's why we're here. That's part of what prompted this industry thought leadership discussion and this webinar. And really, the big difficulty is getting the information from the client. And there are several roadblocks to very good loss review. When you look at why is it that it doesn't happen more often, there are real common roadblocks. And again, it's very important to understand what those roadblocks are so that you can actually address them and implement best practices. None of this is really rocket science, but it's important to be mindful of how all of these things are affecting the ability to go out and get objective data from the client. So just starting with the first, it's the ultimate difficult conversation. It's incredibly uncomfortable for everybody involved when the news is bad. The buyer feels bad. There could be guilt there. It's just something that's very easy to avoid because they spent a very long time with the vendor. I'm sure they tried to maintain some sort of distance and have a boundary there. But at the end of the day, most people feel really, really sorry. You know, they want to give good news, and in this case, they can't. So let's just avoid the conversation altogether. The other thing that's affecting the buyer is that they actually have the work to do. So whatever the opportunity was, whatever the product or service was, whatever budget that they had allocated towards it, there was some business need that compelled the decision to be made, and that business need needs to be satisfied. So in other words, they have to start getting the work done. They're under pressure. They're worried about the success, so on and so forth. So they're busy. They're busy with that. They're on to other things. On the vendor side, there's a lot of disappointment. There could even be devastation, if there's a lot riding on this opportunity, whether it be at the corporate level. They were really betting on a product or feature that they've been working on for 2 years, and this was the pinnacle opportunity, and we lost. And this was supposed to launch us into other areas. This was supposed to be our flagship. It was supposed to be our reference moving forward, what have you. From the salesperson side, it could be extremely intense disappointment to the point of devastation if you were really counting on a commission. As stereotypical as that is absolutely true. It does happen. There's a tremendous amount of pressure for salespeople to make money. Usually their compensation packages, their salaries are fairly low relative to the amount of money they're going to make on commission. They lose the deal. There goes their hopes and dreams for the next quarter or 6 months or a year. So it can be really a very tough pill to swallow. And it's much more instant gratification to be talking to clients that there's some hope involved. Hey, I'm going to go talk to this client who hasn't decided yet. I've got a really good shot at this opportunity. It just feels much more rewarding to spend time talking to people like that rather than having had the door slammed in your face. So I think everybody who's ever been on the sales floor can really identify with that. So it's a difficult conversation. There was a relationship in place. It most likely took a very long time, and now it's over. So what more is there to say? Again, it reinforces those negative feelings. There's a tremendous amount of exposure associated with opening up what feels like Pandora's box or a can of worms, or maybe let's just let the dragon lay sleeping, or whatever that metaphor is. On the buyer side, and this exposure actually has two different flavors depending on what side of the fence you're on. On the buyer side, they may not be sure what to say. Buyers themselves, especially if you're dealing with the business, procurement folks are proficient at having these kinds of discussions. As a matter of fact, they're pretty tough gatekeepers. There's a whole argument to be made to try not to talk just to procurement. I'm going to address that in a little bit. But by and large, if you're talking to the business, whatever decision is that they've made, they perform a certain function. They've been trained in that function. They're experts in that function. It's that functional area where they thrive and that they're confident. Giving information such as this is a business transaction. It's deal making. It's negotiating. Like perhaps they were not trained in negotiation. So in a sense, this is a bit out of their comfort zone. They may not know what to say. They may not know what those lines are. And so it's easy to avoid. Nobody in this particular scenario, nobody ever gets fired from saying nothing. So just say nothing at all. Also, there's no penalty for the buyer in avoiding the conversation. And there's no real compelling incentive, at least, the way things stand right now. There's no reason to talk, so let's just avoid it. Let's avoid that exposure. On the vendor side, you're opening it up to a lot of feedback that is unpredictable. So if I'm the salesperson, especially, and I'm in an opportunity that has been lost, it could have had something to do with me and the way that I presented it, or like I did not return emails fast enough, or whatever the case may be. So maybe it's better to just speculate what the issue was and let sleeping dogs lie. That's it, not dragons. Sleeping dogs lie. Let the sleeping dogs lie, because I'm not sure what the client is going to say, and that's going to be pretty embarrassing for me at my company if it turns out this client actually didn't like my sales presentation style. And that's true for everybody who's been involved in the opportunity, not just the salesperson, but whoever the pre-sales, whoever was directly involved. Really, I can't emphasize enough how vulnerable it feels to have this entire process exposed in this way. And there are ways, one of the best practices is to be sensitive to that, to not let it stop you from inquiring, but to be understanding that there's a lot of exposure here all around. And bias. Bias is absolutely one of the biggest roadblocks, so much so that I felt it deserved its own slide. There are several different types of bias that are at play. So there's bias, both approaching the conversation and even just receiving an email from a client is filtered through a bias if you're not vigilant against bias. So just going through what some of the very common biases are that impact the loss review process. The buyer has a bias. So, just starting actually with the last one first, there's a tendency, again, with instant gratification, with avoiding difficult conversations, that if you do manage to get the buyer on the phone or even an in-person loss review, which would be fabulous, they're very, very rare, but are really great to have that kind of thing happen in person. There's a tendency for the buyer to talk about positive information. They want to deliver good news. They had to say, no, we can't do business with you, but you guys are really great because this, that, and the other. And so there's a bias that causes the buyer to just talk about all the positives, which is very, very nice. You can get your value propositions reinforced, but it ultimately doesn't help understand where is it that we were not competitively fit. So it's important to be aware, of the buyer's tendency to kind of blow smoke, if you will. The other issue is that everyone on the entire planet belongs or lives in some place along the conflict avoidance spectrum. It affects absolutely everybody you'll ever encounter. Some people are very comfortable with it. Some people avoid it like the plague. I myself I've been on all parts of that spectrum throughout my life. And I would say I tend to, my natural state is closer to avoidance than it is, welcoming and feeling comfortable in a potentially conflict situation. But, my training in business has caused me to go closer to the other side of the spectrum where you really have to be comfortable having those difficult conversations. So the buyers themselves are very different along those lines, and it's more of a personality trait than any sort of solid fact. But hopefully you have established a relationship with, you most likely at the end of the opportunity already have an idea of the players on the client side or on the buyer side, and have an idea of where they fall along the conflict avoidance spectrum. So to be very aware of that. Then the sales bias, again, that emotional, your emotional state, which I've already mentioned, is absolutely a strong bias. So that is definitely an issue. But in addition to that, there's something called anchoring, which is, as you're attempting to win, and again, if it's 6 to 12 months, you start out with a win theory, like here's how we're going to win. This is who we think we're competing against. This is where we're strong. This is where we're weak. It's a strategy. It's a theory. It's a strategy that's based on a theory, actually. And as you go along the opportunity, you get little tidbits of information that either help you to adjust your strategy or reinforce your strategy. All of those tidbits of information are also being, filtered through potential bias. And there's something that happens called anchoring, that it doesn't matter if it's real or fact, but if you have a thought or an idea that is not grounded in evidence-based facts, in given enough time, that can transform into an actual belief system. So there's like a time magnification effect that, you have to be aware that your win theory was just a theory, and if you've been committed to that theory and that strategy for a year, it can become a belief system, and it can be very difficult to think of things differently. You get anchored in that belief system. And then there's something called overconfidence, which is the tendency to it's formally defined as the tendency to mistake familiarity with accuracy. So if you've been living and breathing this belief system for a really long time, you can also become very overconfident with it. The second part of the sales bias is that perhaps the relationship that was established with the client in the beginning, and that is the only way to have an appropriate relationship, meaning that, you know, the vendor is very deferential to the buyer throughout the sales cycle. It's by necessity. There's a lot of boundaries there. In other words, you treat the client or the buyer with velvet gloves. And after the fact, after the opportunity is lost, it always surprises me how often those velvet gloves are still on. You know, those social mores almost that have been created throughout this relationship, throughout the sales cycle, are still pretty strong after the fact. Like, you almost have to be reminded. I've actually had to prompt my clients who I do these reviews for, well, isn't it true that you have absolutely nothing left to lose? You know, like, why not, you know, take a different approach? Like, for example, you know, our main contact, procurement, for example, would be very upset if we called the business directly. Well, we just lost the opportunity. So what does it matter if procurement gets upset? You know, no, you don't want to alienate clients. You certainly don't want to burn bridges. But it's amazing how, you know, that velvet glove mentality or you know, that idea stays on when very little, if any, damage would be caused, really, in truth, from a bottom line standpoint, to maybe reaching out to that business person, you know, maybe doing things that you normally wouldn't have done during the sales cycle. A lot of times is still in effect after the fact. The CEO bias is, I've seen this several times, and essentially that means that, you know, some of the work that we do as vendors is experimental. Most, if not all of it, is very risky, and there are degrees of risk. I've seen situations where, you know, the driving force in the organization, which is usually the CEO, has to get investment, you know, has an idea for a software product, you know, sells everybody on the idea, the investors, the rest of the company is attempting to sell the clients. Again, time is going by, the pressure is mounting, and really whether the opportunity wins or loses is either, you know, a thumbs up or a thumbs down for whatever bet the CEO has placed on that product or service and the investment that they collected. You know, maybe there was opposition to going in a certain direction, and the CEO, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the CEO, it could be any senior stakeholder, but I'll just use the CEO for this example. You know, maybe there was a lot of opposition and the CEO drove it forward anyway, so really stood alone, took a huge risk. You know, picture, you know, not Bill Gates, but picture Steve Jobs early on in Apple. So there's the tendency to, I have found, when things start to go south, or if there's any evidence, there's such a commitment to this bet that's been placed that they almost don't even want to know if it's right or wrong. Let's just forge ahead to the next opportunity, because they just can't bear the idea that maybe there's something wrong with the bet that they place. So this is a pretty insidious one, the CEO bias, and very, very high stakes. And finally, the confirmation bias, which I like to call happy ears. And so it's a way of, you know, listening to facts that support what you already believe, and the tendency to ignore information that would maybe kind of change your belief system. So this is a like cognitive behavioral fact. I mean, it's been studied tremendously in business psychology circles, and it's huge. I would say everybody has a confirmation bias for one thing or another, and again, it's called happy ears. So I think that's it on the biases. So the impact on strategy is tremendous for conducting loss reviews. So essentially, there we go. If you actually have information or you don't have information, it's really whether you win or lose that decides, where you're going to put your investment and what decisions you're going to make, the type of resources you're going to hire. And you're making those decisions based on sales. Like, did we do well last year? This really seemed to take off. Like, the market really responded to that, or this particular direction fell flat. So a lot of times you're basing these decisions without actually backed up loss reviews. You're basing these decisions on assumptions, or maybe even perceptions of what actually happened. And hopefully those assumptions and perceptions are correct. But again, a loss review helps to provide data to back up or correct those assumptions and perceptions. And in a sense, an inaccurate loss review, like one that is filtered those biases, is almost worse than no information at all, because it can point you in the completely wrong direction. And we're going to look at that during the case study. So, whether or not you win or lose, and the assumptions that are made there have a tremendous impact on corporate strategy. One could argue it's the lifeblood of any vendor, really. I think I've addressed this several times, that there's a tremendous compounding effect of time, meaning that the longer the time that goes by and the more of these types of assumptions gather up, the bigger the impact on the strategy. And there's something to be aware of, that there really is no way to completely eliminate filters or bias. You really can't get absolute truth. Even with a loss review, an objective loss review conducted by a third party, conducted by McKinsey, if you will, there's going to be filters and bias, but hopefully they'll be minimized. So, really, we're not shooting for perfection here. Maybe we have 2 units of information, and a loss review process, we're looking for another 8, 10, 20 units of information. And we're also looking to see if those first 2 units were correct or not. But if there's an available pool of 50 units of information, you're never going to get that full 50, just to let you know, just to keep that in mind. So I think this bullet repeats what I just said. So again, the goal is a more accurate information spectrum, a broader information spectrum, if you will. Okay. Just want to, before we get into win-loss review best practices themselves, I just want to encourage everybody to please put your questions into the chat, and I'll be addressing them at the end. So now that we have the baseline as to what the difficulties are, what some of the roadblocks are, and what are some of the influencing factors, some of the challenges associated with conducting loss reviews, now we can get into the actual best practices themselves. Whoops. And there we go. Sorry about that. So it's important to understand that your choice of opportunities could actually be a bias in itself. So, really the best way to do it is to have some sort of linear formula, if you will, about a collection of loss reviews that you're going to apply the same exact process to every single time. That's the best case scenario. So for example, all loss reviews for which it was a competitive situation. I mean, there's a lot of business that is conducted in this space that's repeat business. So for example, you won a big project, let's say 5 years ago, and you've been doing business with that buyer ever since. So yes, you've won subsequent business, but perhaps they didn't actually go out and look at 2 other vendors because they had such a great experience with you 5 years ago. They're happy with the output, they're happy with the delivery, they're happy with the price. So, it's really just a matter of, all right, we have some more work, please give us another proposal. Technically that's a win, but it's not quite a competitive win. Thankfully, there's a lot of business like that in this space. So not every opportunity is a competitive situation. So definitely looking at the competitive situations is, all of them that actually are competitive is a way of categorizing the process. You could also look at a group of opportunities within a certain time frame, like everything that took place this quarter. And again, putting these parameters around it is a way of eliminating any bias associated with cherry picking. And before I go on, let me give an example of cherry picking. This actually came up with a client recently that, excuse me, there was an issue that was raised that, I'm going to talk in a little bit about how to conduct the interviews and the actual process itself. But one of the issues that was raised as I was dealing with the internal teams before approaching the buyers was the fact that all of the opportunities we were looking at 4 that took place in a certain year that were lost. They were all post-sale opportunities. So in other words, they were won, and then something went wrong in the delivery, and then they were lost. And they were pretty painful. In a couple of cases, it was like a catastrophic Murphy's Law project where everything that went wrong, that could have gone wrong, did go wrong. And but it was mostly the delivery side. So sales was the one that picked those 4 opportunities. And wouldn't you know it, it was 4 opportunities that delivery supposedly screwed up. Delivery took exception to this and said, well, why is it that, this proposal that I wrote over the weekend for this salesperson last month and it never went anywhere, why is it we can't look at an opportunity like that? And there are hundreds of those. And, there was this giant question mark about what happens to opportunities that are lost before, before they get to delivery's desk. So the choice of the opportunity itself is definitely something to be mindful of. So again, competitive situation, or you can have parameters within a time frame. Once again, let's advance the slide. You can do it across a certain region, so like everything in the US or in the Northeast Territory or in Germany or all of our Asia Pac clients, so on and so forth. You can make it product specific. So there's a problem child product that's just not selling. Let's take a look at all those opportunities. Or on the other side, there's a brand new product that, we want to look at how it's doing or what have you. Or you could look at a dollar threshold. So it's most likely not worth it to do a loss review for a very, very low dollar threshold, highly transactional opportunity, but maybe in your business, it's everything over $100,000 or everything over 500 or everything over $1 million, whatever that threshold might be, or it could be 10 million. So these are ways that you can actually apply a process. Now, the way most vendors actually start out with a formal process is more along the lines of cherry picking. Even though I just said not to do that, it's usually a very painful opportunity or maybe a series of a few painful opportunities that cause a vendor to start doing something like this in a formal way. It gets done, people become familiar with the process, they start to see the value, and generally the clients that we've worked with, their eyes pop open at some of the information that's received. And then they implement something with more formal parameters such as this. So just keep this in mind. This is the advanced win-loss review best practices. Really, to start out, it's a handful of the more painful ones that happened in a given time frame is usually how this gets implemented. The next step is to develop your loss theory. So, if there were 5 different people involved in an opportunity, there's most likely 5 different theories as to how we lost or why we lost, or at least 2. And some of them maybe folks aren't going to want to say in a group, so it's important. The first step is to actually conduct interviews of all the stakeholders individually and to find out what did everybody else think. And this is true for even the folks, every single person who was directly involved, you definitely want to get their perspective, whether it's, the VP of sales or, the sales admin that was just tagging along to take the minutes of the meeting. You want to get everybody's perspective. Everybody is picking up on different tidbits of information. The thing about all stakeholders, and this impacts people who were not directly involved, if it's the VP of delivery or maybe like the key, product manager or even the CFO, none of them perhaps interface with the client throughout the sales cycle, but they have very strong opinions and they are the primary input for corporate strategy. So if you don't interview them and get their buy-in on the loss theory, then they're probably not going to listen to whatever results you have. So it's important to be extremely inclusive all over the map to anybody. I like to say anybody who has a strong opinion about what happened here, that's who you want to talk to. Anyone who is directly involved and anyone who has a strong opinion. Senior stakeholders always have strong opinions. Whoops, and that was the bullet that didn't realize that bullet said that verbatim, but there you have it. You want to write up a summary because these loss reviews are great. It's a moment in time, but this is such high caliber information. It tends to be looked at. It's got a very long lifespan. It's like the derivative of all of the entire sales cycle and corporate strategy, if you will, is personified by what the client actually tells you when you lose. So it tends to have a very long lifespan. So it's important to put it in context, like write up a summary, list out the contacts, as if, no one involved is going to be here in 2 years. So let's write it up so that whoever is here in 2 years, not saying that that's true, but, you want to be able to provide the full context. And again, you want to list all the theories. So if there are 3 different theories, don't just go with whatever, he who shouts the loudest. List them all out. And this then becomes the basis for the interview. And as a part of this process, you want to write up a list of questions. What I like to say here, and again, thinking about taking those velvet gloves off, everything you ever wanted to ask the client but never had the nerve or never had the opportunity or it was just never appropriate to ask the buyer, now's the time. And list out those questions. And I have a slide on an example list of questions in a couple of slides. So then there's the issue, and this is probably the primary objection that I hear, is getting buyers to spend the time. And I find that the 80-20 rule applies, that 80% of the buyers are happy to spend the time. And when asked and when the request is positioned correctly. And the reason being is that people really do want to help. They like to talk about themselves. They like to share their opinions. Probably most of all, aside from money and recognition or whatever, there's a basic human need to have an impact on the world around you. And if you could tap into that, the idea that, hey, by opening up that information spigot, you're going to have a huge impact on this organization, which is 100% true. If you can tap into that and really kind of elucidate that when you're requesting the time from the client, that's probably the most compelling reason for the buyer to spend the time. And 80% of the time they do. And it also alleviates whatever guilt or they're feeling bad. That happens a lot as well. 20%, I would say, and this might actually be a generous number, are, that's where you're not going to get any responses. And usually these are folks who are, they're the gatekeepers. A lot of times they come out of procurement. They could be very low on the totem pole, and therefore they have no idea what to say, so they say nothing at all, like they're extremely risk adverse. Or they're simply not visionary. They don't realize that the vendor that they help today is the job prospect that they're going to be applying to 2 years from now. I mean, it's a very small industry. So there's a lot of reasons, and really the best thing that you can do is recognize this early on and move on to, to other folks who are more responsive. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well. Another way, and this is probably one of the highest impact ways of getting buyers to spend their time, is to use somebody who wasn't involved, like the salesperson or even the VP of sales or anybody who was involved in that relationship for that entire year should not be the one to ask. The client is most likely not going to be forthcoming because of the relationship issues, because of everything I mentioned in the beginning. They feel bad. There's been too many social mores that have been developed throughout that relationship for that client to overcome. Only the most comfortable people on the conflict avoidance spectrum will be able to have a very honest dialogue with somebody who was involved the whole time. And when most people fall closer to conflict avoidance, how do you bypass it? Get somebody who wasn't involved. Now, obviously, I'm here because I'm a consultant who actually does this. If that's not an option for your organization, anybody within the organization who has good interview skills can be trained to do this. And I've seen an administrative assistant who was actually a journalism major do an excellent job at this. And in another organization, there was a CFO who did this, who really wasn't familiar. He was actually kind of awkward in the questions that he was asking, but it was excellent because it really reinforced to the client that this was a safe person to talk to. It helped to, his awkwardness helped to establish the comfort. And he also didn't know what to say or what not to say, so he just went for broke and asked absolutely everything. And it was amazing the way it worked out. You have to establish trust. The client is afraid that you're still trying to sell them. You're still trying to change their mind. So the number one thing you have to say is that there's no chance we're going to win your business. We know that. We're just trying to learn. We're conducting research. If it's a research project, they're going to be much more forthcoming. And if you don't state that ahead of time and reinforce it ahead of time, they may not know that. Just a phone call like, hey, let's talk, is most likely going to be avoided. And it's a courtship. If you ask once, and again, if you're feeling bad about the opportunity and you ask once and they don't respond, it could be a tendency, let me move on to a customer who actually wants to talk to me. So to consider it an actual courtship and don't go away. You deserve to have this information. So what I like to do is just introduce with a voicemail, then I send an email, then I call again, like once a week, every week, and don't go away. There's a technique that if there were 4 people on the buyer side that were involved, be very clear about the fact that, I'm going to be asking everybody. It's not just the main contact. Best practices, our policy dictates that I have to go out to everybody we spoke to. If the buyer knows that you're going to be asking their peers, that tends to get a response. Maybe they discuss it internally and decide who is it that's going to talk. But if that person knows you're going to be reaching out to other people, that's a nice prompter. Again, it's not obnoxious, but it's kind of just gently demanding, like, hey, we really need this information, and we're going to reach out and get it. And it's again, thinking about the buyer working very hard in their project, having other priorities. Think about, there's no reason to ask for this call tomorrow. You may emotionally want the information tomorrow, but it's much more realistic. Anybody can put a calendar item down 4 to 6 weeks from now. And then just if you get that calendar item, just gently prompt, all right, looking forward to talking to you in 3 weeks, so that it doesn't completely fall off their radar. So when you go 6 weeks out, no matter what the topic is, people are a lot freer and looser with their calendar than anything this week or next week or even the week after. So don't even try for the next 3 weeks is what I'm saying here. And, again, advertise the fact that their opinion is going to have a major impact on the organization, that, it's from their mouth to the board of directors' ears, which, by the way, is the truth. And why not say it? These are folks, again, in their functional area, whether it be manufacturing or clinical operations. They generally don't get to speak to a whole heck of a lot of board of directors, in the hallways and in their functional area. The fact that they are having an impact on a board of directors anywhere is heady stuff for some people. And again, if it's true, why not say it? So here's an example. You guys are going to get the slides, and I'm realizing I still have several slides to get through before the end of this webinar. I'll go through these, but you will be getting them, and you'll just notice that everything I just said is highlighted in this particular area, especially this, Again, many times decision makers feel compelled to soften the blow. Please, I like the good, the bad, but especially the ugly. So that kind of it sets the tone. We're not looking for compliments. We're looking for the truth here. And again, your input will go directly to senior management and the board of directors. So in terms of the interview itself, the number one thing is to be completely objective. Regardless of who does it, the only feelings that should be felt by the interviewer is curiosity and feeling in the spirit of research. Groups tend to kill loss reviews. The bigger the group, the less forthcoming people are. So no matter what, make it one-on-one. If you're stuck with a group, that's better than nothing at all, but almost not better than nothing at all. One-on-one conversations, people tend to open up. Try to use verbatim quotes. Like again, if you say the sky is blue and you're the buyer, and I tell everybody, well, he said that the sky was really nice looking today. That's a filter. That's a bias right there. So if he says the sky was blue, write down the sky was blue. As many quotes, actual buyer quotes as you can use, there's the data itself. You don't want to reinterpret what the client said. And you can't record, unfortunately. That's just a big no-no. But if you can't write and interview at the same time, have a third party listening in, taking notes, like an admin. It's a nice thing to simply ask the buyer, well, tell me the story of how this went. Tell me the story of what this decision was like. That's how I open these interviews, and it's a good 5 to 10 minutes of a story, and that answers a good 70% of the questions that I had. And then open-ended questions. I have an example of a list of questions. These questions are generated as you're conducting your internal interviews, talking to internal stakeholders. But it's not a to-do list. It's really seeds that hopefully the conversation will grow organically, and you can reference your list of questions to keep it on track. And there is one technique, if the buyer is again being very, very complimentary, then you can ask one leading question, which is admitting to whatever it is we did wrong. Like, okay, here's what we feel our failing is. What did you think about that? Did that go over like a lead balloon or what? You could kind of open it up there. And if you own the bad news first, it helps the client to become more forthcoming. Here's a list of just some basic questions. You can go through this afterwards. Were you surprised by anything? What did you see in the competitors that you liked or didn't like? What did you see about us? How were we on price? We thought that these two value propositions were what you liked most about us, what nobody else had. Is that true? And you'll be very surprised by what you find. In terms of price, this is always the big issue. It's always the elephant under the carpet in the living room, or whatever that metaphor is. You never actually need to ask for exact pricing because if you have two variables, you can solve for the third. And I'll give you an example of that. If you ask for percentages, and where were we over and above the choice that you made? The first variable is our price point, which we know. If the client says, yeah, you were 30% above our selection, well, that's variable number 2, and then you can solve for X. So you never really need to ask the client what the price was. And this is one of my favorite graphical representations of algebra. I actually have a t-shirt that looks like that. Some other questions, where were we in the range? And again, asking about percentages, that's the way to get the price. And just to wrap up on conducting the interview itself, if you don't actually understand something, probe, because you're going to have to explain this to the stakeholders afterwards. And, it's okay to stop, repeat, rephrase what the client said, say, oh, so what I'm hearing you say is so-and-so. So it's very easy to conduct the internal interviews, talk to the client, and just to scroll through the communication loop here, report to management, and then, management pretty much got what it wanted, and then the loop ends there. It's really important to go back to both the internal teams that were exposed in the sense that they participated directly, and to the clients themselves, to thank the clients from senior management, from the board of directors. You could even put in a really great thing to do. I've actually never seen this done, but I always recommend it. If you can say, well, this is what we learned, and this is how you impacted our organization, that is dynamite stuff. And the reason to close that loop is because the next time you want to conduct a loss review, whether it be with that client or especially the internal teams, if they don't get that back, that thank you back, or that understanding of what their impact was, why they spent the time, why they exposed themselves to become vulnerable to this kind of scrutiny, they don't understand, they're going to be much less likely to do it in the future. So it's a very easy thing to neglect to do, and I always strongly recommend, against neglecting this part. There could be sensitive issues that come up. So that there may be some internal filtering, like this is where it is okay to filter, after the fact. What I like to say is that, in a solid process, everybody takes a hit eventually. Like one opportunity, it's going to be delivery. The other opportunity, it's going to be, like implementation, which is an aspect of delivery. The other one, it could be a feature that the product manager a year and a half ago didn't think was important. And then on another opportunity, it could be the salespeople. So if you do a process, eventually everybody gets exposed, everybody feels vulnerable. Where you fall down is when this becomes something where sales is simply continuing to point the finger at the rest of the organization. It's critical to make sure the win-loss reviews don't fall along those lines. So now, and just to wrap up with the win reviews and just leave a couple of minutes for questions, let's just go back here. Oh, I'm sorry, the loss review case. Before we can get to the win review, the loss review case study, long story short, it was a typical pivotal opportunity, a huge amount of pressure. It was lost to a number one competitor. The loss theory was that there was a European module for this technology, I believe it was clinical operations, that was missing. And so the answer was, we are going to invest $1 million over the next 6 months. We're going to put everything else on hold. We're going to bang this feature out, because we lost this huge deal. So that was what was on the line. Again, there were other products and services that were going to suffer as a result. After we did the loss review, what we found was a series of other things that, the European module was actually a minor gap. What was a big issue was the hosting, which we had thought was a minor issue. But apparently we didn't answer the question. We didn't realize we gave them a red flag. The competitor seemed way more solid there. We thought our user interface was a huge value proposition, but we found out that it was actually pretty close to the competitors. Where we did find out, we were surprised, our integration APIs, our roadmap were both very superior. So that helped us with future opportunities, talking about what our value propositions actually are, that we were kind of emphasizing points that weren't carrying as much water as we thought they were. Our price, we were going to undercut the price as well as invest $1 million. Turns out we're on par with the market. Some other things here. The number one reason why we lost, however, was that the sales process itself, we had absolutely no idea about this. We had a sales force that was in 2 years prior that apparently was so over the top, if you will, negative, that this client in a different functional area had a horrible experience. They were in the hallway when we were on a WebEx, and we were completely unaware of this. The client was embarrassed and never told us that this was happening. This person came in, had the client put the group on hold and said, don't ever do business with this company. Their salespeople are terrible. They'll never stop calling you. It was a horrible experience. That happened very early on in the sales cycle and colored absolutely everything else. All these other facts up here could not escape the bad press and the legacy of negativity that we had that we were unaware of the entire time. And we were about to spend $1 million on a product, on a feature that would never have helped us. So this kind of really clarifies why doing a loss review is so important. So I'm going to, we did get a few questions, but I think we've run out of time. I will address them on email. What I'd like to do is finish up with the win reviews in the last couple of minutes we have, just to talk about why it's important. And again, there are roadblocks to doing win reviews. Mostly, you're so relieved that you won, we have to get going now. You know, we've got to get onto the project. So the actual work itself tends to take priority, and you know, everything else kind of falls by the wayside. The client now they're happy they won, but now they're putting the vendor on the hook. We want to see you deliver. We really don't want to talk about anything else. We want to talk about the scope of work that we're giving you $500,000 to deliver in the next 6 months. And all the other biases are still at play, you know, like the anchoring, the win theories. So essentially, the reason why it's important to do a win review is that the theory may have information at this level. During delivery, you know, whether it's long-term or short-term, you're going to learn a lot more, you know, just in the natural course of having a new client. But doing a win review, you can actually get a lot more information, which is why it's important to do that extra effort. And here are some examples of win review questions. I would say that win reviews are probably the primary source of competitive information, because this client that you're now so busy delivering to just saw the competitors in great detail. So it's the best place to get competitive information, and to also find out, was there any dissent in the ranks when you decided to go with us? Did anybody not want to? And the great reason to ask that question is, you know, though, if it's a long-term engagement, that will rear its head again. You know, if somebody didn't want to work with us, chances are they're going to be coming down the line in a project meeting with a complaint. So it's good to know about it sooner rather than later. And you can benchmark your pricing, so on and so forth. So with that, I do apologize for not having any time for some of the questions, some really good ones, and I'll just list out what they are. Ever have any problems with information that was too sensitive? What if the client simply won't answer or respond? What's too long of a time period to do a loss review? So I think that what this means is the impact of time gone by. Like, can we only do it for the last 6 months, or we have something from 2 years ago? When is the right time to do a win review? And then, can you utilize the CRM for any of this? And the answer to that question is yes. And so what I'll do is I will follow up with an email to all of the attendees with the answers to those questions. And, you know, again, please don't ever hesitate to ask me or Monique about win reviews, whether it's to help you conduct your own or to actually do them for you. We're here to help, and we're very passionate about this subject. And again, we are looking to advocate for this to the drug sponsors themselves within the next year or so. So again, have a great day. Thank you so much for attending.